Napoleon Bonaparte, born on the small island of Corsica, is one of the most famous men to have ever lived, hailed as the man of the 19th century. Even his very name is used as a word to describe something momentous, colossal, Napoleonic. A rags to riches story, Napoleon was only 24 years old when he became a general, and 35 when he crowned himself Emperor of the French. Charismatic leader of men, shrewd politician, and a military genius, Napoleon fought 60 battles in his career and only lost 7 of them, making him the most victorious general in history. Not since the days of ancient Rome and the Caesars had one man conquered so much of Europe, or held so much power. As a ruler of France and its empire for nearly 15 years, Napoleon was also a reformer and improver. He played a leading role in solidifying the gains and ideals of the French Revolution, promoting equality and careers open to talent, securing religious freedom and tolerance, ending aristocratic and feudal privilege, and founding the Civil Code, a unified and progressive code of laws which are still in use across Europe to this day. Napoleon's empire helped provide the basis of what is today the European Union. For this reason, Napoleon is often considered the father of modern Europe, and ever since him, the world was never really the same. To this day, Napoleon remains one of the most written about men in history, second only to Jesus Christ, inspiring masterpieces of music, art, literature and poetry, from Beethoven's stirring Third Symphony to Tolstoy's War and Peace. Few fictional characters have ever done as much as Napoleon Bonaparte. The so-called man of destiny and a mass of contradictions, Napoleon is still something of an enigma, both a hopeless romantic idealist and the bitterest of cynics. The combination of his irresistible charm when he chose to deploy it, his iron will, workaholic habits, inspirational speeches and sayings, sheer intellect, and of course his fiery temperament, captivated or alarmed. To some he was a god, to others the Antichrist. And his meteoric rise and then crushing downfall has been compared to a Greek tragedy. After less than 15 years in power, in the last of 7 wars formed against him by coalitions of European monarchs, Napoleon was finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo and exiled to the remote rocky island of St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. At the end of his life, reflecting on his misfortunes, Napoleon's analysis was, "I have too much ambition and a spirit afire." This is the story of Napoleon and the dawn of a new age. The rise of an obscure Corsican boy to the very pinnacle of fame and fortune, from soldier to statesman to emperor, has spellbound generation after generation. Having graduated as an officer at the age of 16, Napoleon began his army career as a second lieutenant, posted to various garrisons throughout the south of France. The death of his father had left him as the main breadwinner for his large family in Corsica. In the years just before the French Revolution, from now on, Napoleon would have to grow up quickly. Napoleon arrived with his best friend Alexandre at his new garrison in Valence. Officers lived in billets, and Napoleon found himself a first-floor room on the front of Café Cercle. It was a noisy little room with just a bed, table and armchair, and he could hear the click of billiard balls in the salon next door. But he liked the old landlady Madame Bou, who would also mend his clothes for him, and, clinging to old habits, whenever he was in Valence, he would always return to lodge with her. Napoleon and his pampered fellow nobles were to enter the army shockingly ill-prepared for military life. Napoleon was to learn soldiering on the job. For the first 9 weeks, all the new officers served in the ranks and got first-hand experience of the ordinary soldier's duties and rigorous drill, including mounting the guard. As Napoleon was soon to discover, the rank and file were ill-paid and slept 2 in a bed. Until recently it had been 3, but at least they were never flogged, whereas soldiers in the English and Prussian armies often were. Indeed, a sentence of 800 lashes was not unknown. When Napoleon was fully qualified, in the mornings he usually attended gun manoeuvres and practiced firing. It was here that Napoleon learned the fundamentals of war, for lack of which many officers of noble birth had quickly closed careers that began with promise in disaster. There too, Napoleon learned the hardest of all lessons, prompt obedience. Eyewitnesses at the time described Napoleon as a meditative and reserved young man, little given to conversation, defiant yet shy. His cheeks were hollow, his mouth had an air of seriousness, as if pursed up with care, his eyes were alert and observant. Some say that it was here that Napoleon first adopted the iconic gesture which was to characterise him for the rest of his life, the habit of resting his right hand between the fold of his waistcoat. This stance had been a distinctive trait of lieutenants of the Lafayette regiment for years, but others claim that Napoleon did it out of imitation of the toga-wearing Romans. Though as eager as ever for work, and more interested in mastering his new profession than amusing himself in the garrison town, off duty Napoleon began to enjoy himself. There were balls, and the young officer even began to take dancing lessons. Still, it seems that Napoleon did somewhat shy away from his fellow officers. Instead, Napoleon was introduced to the local gentry and the bourgeois families of Valence. The abbé of the town introduced Napoleon to Madame Colombière, who hosted the town's leading salon and took a motherly interest in him. The 16-year-old Napoleon, in spite of his shabby clothes and ungainly boots, became something of a favourite. He was known for his extensive knowledge, strong reasoning faculties, and when he was in one of his better moods, quick wit. In the winter, Madame Colombière invited him to stay at her country house, where he met her young daughter, Caroline. Napoleon recalled, "We were the most innocent creatures imaginable. We often used to contrive little assignations together. I recollect one in particular, which took place on a midsummer's morning, just as the light was about to dawn. It may not be believed, but our sole delight on that occasion consisted of eating cherries together." There was apparently even talk of the two marrying. But as Napoleon was well aware, he was too poor to do so. He was only an artillery lieutenant, but Napoleon always remembered Caroline fondly, and they kept in touch on and off throughout the years. Decades later, at the height of his power, Napoleon gave her a present of a ring he had had specially made for her, carved with people picking cherries. Around this time, another upper-class young lady had attracted his attention. Napoleon, who liked to make up his own names for girlfriends, had called her Emma. But he was not very eligible, and Emma seems to have treated him with disdain. He accused her of being cold and indifferent towards him. Napoleon wrote to her, trying to soften her. "My feelings," he wrote, "are worthy of you. Tell me that you do them justice." After his unsuccessful attempt to make her take an interest in him, Napoleon asked Emma to return the 4 short letters he had written her. "You took pleasure in humiliating me, but you are too good to hold up to ridicule my ill-fated feelings." Naturally, Napoleon kept the details of this early rejection to himself. But after this, the teenager seemed to shy away from girls, and the money that his fellow officers spent on courting, Napoleon spent on his family, and occasionally, when he could afford them, books. During his time as a subaltern, Alexandra delicately noted as one of Napoleon's characteristics that he was exceptionally clean living. Alexandra often reproached his friend for having very little fun, and Napoleon quipped back, "The stronger a man's mind is, the more he needs to use it. If he lets it fall asleep, there's a danger he will lose it." Girlfriends, Napoleon once declared, made Alexandra neglect his parents and friends, which they even had an argument about, as Napoleon wrote up in his notebook, clearly still coming to terms with his unrequited feelings for Emma. "What, sir? You ask me what love is? Are you then made of different stuff from other men?" Alexandra exclaimed. "I am not asking you for a definition of love. I was once in love, and I still remember enough about the matter to enable me to dispense with those conceptual definitions which only tend to confuse things. I do more than to deny its existence. I believe it to be positively injurious to society and to the individual happiness of everyone. In short, I believe this thing called love does more harm than good, and that it would be a blessing if some benevolent God were to rid mankind of it altogether." Napoleon's salary as a second lieutenant was paltry, and was not enough to support him in the rank of gentleman officer, which exposed him, sensitive as he was, to shame. He existed partly on charity, and could barely even afford a coffee, so the cafe owner often treated him to free ones. When money got especially tight, Napoleon could do little else but shut himself up in his room. There, in his loneliness, he was often desperately unhappy, even suicidal. He wrote in his notebook, "Always alone, in the midst of men, I come back to my rooms, to dream with myself, and surrender myself to all the force of my melancholy. Which way is she facing today? On the side of death." In the dawn of my days, I can still hope to live a long time. If I had already passed 60, I would respect the prejudice of my contemporaries, and I would wait patiently for nature to complete its course. But since I begin to experience misfortunes, that nothing is pleasure for me, why would I put up with days when nothing prospers? My thoughts dwell on death. What great rage drives me to wish for my own destruction? Perhaps it is because I see no place for myself in this world. Since I must die, should I not just kill myself? Life is a burden to me because I enjoy no pleasure and everything is painful. It is a burden because the men with whom I live, and will probably always live, have morals as different to mine as the light of the moon differs from that of the sun. Throughout these days, Napoleon always stayed in close touch with his family. His younger brother, Lucien, was studying at Brienne, but now he was refusing to become a soldier as his family wished, and spent all his time reading literature instead. But he was not a state-subsidized pupil, and his school fees were a heavy price for the Bonapartes to pay. Only his little sister, Marianne, was provided for by the state. Currently, none of his other siblings were being given any proper education. Worried over the news, Napoleon tried to get leave of absence. Eventually, it was granted because of poor health, and at the end of the year, the young officer at last went home. Napoleon had remained on the continent for nearly 8 years, from the age of 9 to 17. He spent much of the next 7 years making up for lost time. Indeed, he spent 4 years of these on Corsica, as he somehow repeatedly persuaded his senior officers to give him permission for many leaves of absence. Of his return home, Napoleon contemplated in his notebook, "What spectacle will I see in my country? My fellow countrymen are weighed down with chains, while they kiss with fear the hand that oppresses them. They are no longer those brave Corsicans who the heroic Paoli animated with his virtues, enemies of tyrants, of luxury, of vile courtiers. Frenchmen, not content with having robbed us of everything we held dear, have also corrupted our morals. The current picture of my homeland, and the powerlessness to change it, is therefore a new reason to flee this land, where I am obliged by duty to praise men whom virtue compels me to hate. When I arrive in my country, what a face I must make, what language I must hold. A good patriot ought to die when his fatherland has ceased to exist." Napoleon was reunited with his widowed mother, who still wore black in mourning, and he met all of his siblings, 3 of whom he had never met before. It was high time that Napoleon appeared at Casa Bonaparte. Napoleon's family was again in trouble. His mother had tried silkworm raising and failed. The head of the family, their uncle the archdeacon, was too ill to attend to family business, while the family's old patron and protector, the French governor of the island, Marbeuf, died suddenly, and his brothers were unsuccessful in getting positions or employment. Napoleon dove in. Having left home as a boy, he returned as a responsible and competent young man. At once he tried to set matters on a better footing. Although suffering from a tertian fever, he fixed up the little house at Mileli, tried to help his mother in her attempts at mulberry growing for the silkworms and salt works, saw to it that his brother Joseph went into the oil trade, and brightened up his uncle with political discussions. Napoleon also took charge of seeking school places and scholarships for his younger brothers and sisters, and pursued his family's legal and financial cases in the courts and ministries. Meanwhile, Napoleon and his older brother, Joseph, were finally reunited. They took daily walks together and read their books by the seashore. Napoleon explored the island so well, he said, that I could recognize it with my eyes closed, by the sweet perfume of its liquid. "Oh," Joseph later said, "the glorious emperor will never indemnify me for the loss of that Napoleon whom I loved so dearly, whom I should like to see again as I knew him in 1786. Napoleon would definitely have noticed all the rusticity of Corsica. In the summer, the people avoided the cathedral because of the local custom of burying the dead under the church floorboards. Incense was constantly burned to mask the foul odour. Animals were often killed in the streets for market, and their hides hung out to dry in full view. Most of his relatives could not speak French, or like his mother Laetitia, spoke it poorly. Caught between two cultures, at first Napoleon mainly socialised with his fellow French officers in the garrison, and most of them were staunch royalists. During one dinner, one of them remembered of Napoleon, "I do not recall his face at all, and his personality even less, but his mind was so sharp and moralistic for a young man of his age, a French officer too, that the idea of making him my friend did not cross my mind. My knowledge of ancient and modern history was too sparse to argue with him. Our comrades also saw him as slightly ridiculous and over-scrupulous. We even believed that his professorial tone was assumed and meaningless, until one day when he argued so strongly on the rights of nations, especially his own, that we could not recover from our amazement. He said that it was very surprising that Monsieur Baran thought to prevent them from deliberating about their affairs, adding in a forbidding tone, "Monsieur Baran does not know the Corsicans. He will see what they can do." This expression gave the measure of his character. One of our comrades scoffingly replied, "Would you draw your sword against a soldier of the king?" He made no reply. We separated coldly. It was the last time this man did me the honours of dinner. Since Governor Marbeuf's death, the island was administered by the Ministry of Finance. A set of bureaucrats had moved in, and since France was heading for bankruptcy, they had been given orders to cut spending. They refused to pay the subsidies due to Laetitia, unless the French government proved to be complacent and generous. The Bonapartes were threatened with bankruptcy. Napoleon's first reaction was to seek justice. By the next year, 18-year-old Napoleon went to Paris to see the man at the top, the Controller General. Napoleon stated the owed sum, but added with feeling that no sum could ever compensate for the kind of debasement a man experiences when he is constantly made aware of his subjection. The ministry did not pay Laetitia her money. Again, Napoleon took action. He wrote to the Registrar of the Corsican States General, who happened to be his godfather, protesting about unenergetic officials where the decision lies with one man, who is a stranger not only to our language and habits, but also to our legal system, envious of the luxury he has seen on the continent, and which his salary does not allow him to attain. Napoleon's letter had no effect. These two cases of injustice, both affecting his widowed mother, changed Napoleon's whole attitude to the French in Corsica. Their rule in Corsica was an example of the injustice inherent in the French system. That rule, Napoleon decided, must be ended, and Corsica again free. Napoleon later remarked, "I learned how to handle a conquered people through having been a member of a conquered society." During Napoleon's short stay in Paris, he left his room only at mealtimes for one of the little eating houses in the district, where he lunched or dined on 3 pence a dish. And as though ashamed of how little he could afford to spend, he would fold up his money in the bill and hand it silently to the cashier. One evening, to cheer himself up, Napoleon went for a walk in the Palais Royal. Here were bright lights, gambling houses, brothels, boutiques, dozens of the city's finest restaurants and coffee houses, which attracted intellectuals and free thinkers. Napoleon walked about, he says, taking long strides, and recorded the remainder of his eventful evening in his diary. "I am vigorous by temperament and didn't mind the cold, but after a time my mind became numb, and then I did notice how cold it was. I turned into the arcades. I was on the point of entering a cafe when I noticed a woman. It was late. She had a good figure and was very young. She was clearly a prostitute. I looked at her and she stopped. Instead of the disdainful manner such women usually affect, she seemed quite natural. I was struck by that. Her shyness gave me the courage to speak to her. Yes, I spoke to her, though more than most people I hate prostitution, and have always felt sullied just by a look from a woman like that. But her pale cheeks, the impression she gave of weakness, and her soft voice at once overcame my doubts. Either she will give me interesting information, I said to myself, or she's just a fool. "You're going to catch the cold," I said. "How can you bear to walk in the arcades?" "Ah, sir, I keep on hoping. I have to finish my evening's work." She spoke with a calm indifference which appealed to me, and I began to walk beside her. "You don't look very strong. I'm surprised you're not exhausted by a life like this." "Heavens, sir, a woman has to do something." "Maybe. But isn't there some other job better suited to your health?" "No, sir, I've got to live." I was enchanted. At least she answered my questions, something which other women declined to do. "You must be from the north to brave cold like this." "I'm from Nantes in Brittany." "That's the part I know." "Mademoiselle, please tell me how you lost your maidenhood." "It was an army officer." "Are you angry?" "Oh yes, take my word for it." Her voice took on a pungency that I hadn't noticed before. "Take my word for that. My sister is well set up. Why aren't I?" "How did you come to Paris?" "The officer who did me wrong walked out. I loathe him. My mother was furious with me and I had to get away. A second officer came along and took me to Paris. He deserted me too. Now there's a third. I've been living 3 years with him. He's French but has business in London and he's there now. Let's go to your place." "What will we do there?" "Come on, we'll get warm and you'll have your fill of pleasure. I was far from feeling over-scrupulous at this stage. Indeed, I didn't want her to be frightened off by my questions, or for her to say that she didn't sleep with strangers, when that was probably the whole point of my approaching her. By the fact that Napoleon had thought it worth writing down, this was the first time Napoleon ever slept with a woman, but Napoleon described it as a philosophical experience, and it seems it was something more than a mere physical encounter. Napoleon had tried to get to know the young prostitute as a person, and felt sympathetic towards her plight. In June 1788, Napoleon was posted to a new garrison in Auxonne. As Napoleon himself wrote at this time, "A man must follow his fate, and must accept the conditions of his profession. A soldier can be constant to nothing but his flag." At its Royal Artillery School, courses were offered in mathematics, mechanics, physics and drawing. Due to his education here, "There is nothing in the military profession I cannot do for myself," Napoleon later claimed. "If there is no one to make gunpowder, I know how to make it. Gun carriages, I know how to construct them. If it's founding a cannon, I know that. Or if the details of tactics must be taught, I can teach them." As usual, Napoleon threw himself into his work. Here, Napoleon got along well with his fellow officers, but he had found no friendly old abbé to help him enter the intellectual salons of the town, and so Napoleon hardly went out at all. He mainly stayed in his room and continued his work, which continued well into the night, and often woke up to find he had fallen asleep amidst his notes. In this way he kept out of debt, ate little, and was poor but proud. Napoleon later said of this period of his life, "Do you know how I managed? By never entering a café or going into society, by eating dry bread and brushing my own clothes so that they might last longer. I lived like a bear in a little room, with books for my only friends. I breakfasted off dry bread, but I bolted the door on my poverty." Money had become so scarce in the Bonaparte family that when Napoleon needed linen from home, he paid his mother the cost of sending it, and sometimes he had to keep his letters short to save on postage. In a letter to his mother, Napoleon revealed, "Work accepted, I have no other refuge. I change clothes but once in 8 days. Since my illness, I have been sleeping very little. It's incredible. I go to bed at 10 and get up at 4. I take but one meal a day at 3 o'clock. This, I find, is good for my health." But Napoleon was still dreaming of Corsica. "However, I would rather be eating ravioli and lasagna in Ajaccio." Meanwhile, the commander of the camp at Auxonne, General de Taille, who happened to be one of the leading gunners of the 18th century, entrusted Napoleon with building a polygon, placing him at the head of 200 men. This was a very important work, and irritated Napoleon's superior captains against him. But Napoleon's comrades also showed their faith in him, as they entrusted him with writing the codes of the officers' mess, its laws and regulations, a constitution. In it, Napoleon enforced propriety, good manners, courtesy and chivalry. But his fellow lieutenants were amused by how seriously this 19-year-old took the job of lawgiver, and by the complexity of the structures he set in place in the 4,500-word document he wrote. Indeed, with Napoleon's comrades, there were still occasional discords. In the room above his, an officer named Belly de Bussy unluckily took a fancy to learning to play the horn, but played it so out of tune that it completely disturbed Napoleon's studies. One day, Napoleon came across Belly on the staircase. "My dear fellow, haven't you had enough of playing that damned instrument?" "Not in the least." "Well, other people have." "I'm sorry for it." "It would be better if you went to practice elsewhere." "I am master of my own apartment." "Perhaps you may be taught to entertain a doubt on that point." "I scarcely think anyone would be bold enough to attempt to teach me that." Belly challenged Napoleon to a duel, and Napoleon accepted. But before they met, their friends stepped in and resolved the dispute harmoniously. During one of his stays in Auxonne, to help out his mother, who had her hands full with 4 infant children, Napoleon offered to take his little 9-year-old brother Louis back with him to France, to support and educate him, and to share his billet. It's a mystery how the 2 brothers somehow managed to live on Napoleon's meagre pay. Louis had to sleep on the floor in a closet next to Napoleon's bed, and they used an old wooden box, both as a desk and a bookcase. Despite the money pressures, the 2 brothers got on well together. Louis was Napoleon's favourite brother in the family, just as Napoleon was Louis's favourite. Napoleon served as his tutor here, taking full responsibility for his education. In return, Louis helped Napoleon correct the spelling mistakes in his writings. Unlike his more rebellious younger brother Lucien, Louis was very grateful to Napoleon. Indeed, he almost worshipped him. As Napoleon proudly wrote home, Louis is studying hard, learning to write French. I am teaching him mathematics and geometry. He reads history. He will turn out extremely well. All the women here are in love with him. He has already acquired the French manner, polished vivacity. He knows how to behave, bows most gracefully, and asks all the right questions with all the seriousness and dignity of a man of 30. I see well enough that he will turn out the best of us four. It must be said, however, that none of us has had so good an education. One morning, Napoleon knocked on the floor to wake up his brother and call him to breakfast in his studies, but Louis stayed fast asleep, and Napoleon tried to wake him again. Come, my Louis, he said. What's the matter this morning? It seems to me that you're very lazy. Oh, brother, I was having such a beautiful dream. And what did you dream? Asked Napoleon. Louis sat upright on the edge of his blanket. I dreamed that I was a king. A king? Well, Napoleon exclaimed, with a laugh and a glance around their dismal room. And what then, your majesty, was I, your brother? An emperor, perhaps? Then Napoleon shrugged his shoulders and pinched his brother's ear. Well, kings and emperors must eat and work, the same as lieutenants and schoolboys. Come then, King Louis, some broth, and then to your duty. Louis, who would later become King of Holland, recorded this incident in his memoirs. That almost didn't happen. Around this time, the young lieutenant and his comrades decided to go for a swim, but while Napoleon was swimming, he was seized by a sudden cramp. He sank under the current and passed out. He claimed that he experienced all the sensation of dying. While his comrades frantically searched for him, the current of the river guided him towards shallower waters. He drifted onto a sandbank and washed up on the riverbed. Still unconscious, Napoleon was pulled out of the water by his comrades. All of a sudden he coughed, choking up the water, and recovered after a few minutes. He almost ended up in this river again. During a heated discussion with some fellow officers, presumably royalists, Napoleon expressed his republican beliefs, and they tried to throw him in it. As a second lieutenant, Napoleon spent most of his free time reading and studying. He put himself through almost the equivalent of a university course. Given Napoleon's relatively modest background, his passionate temperament, and his taste for lockstep reasoning and absolute conclusions, it's not surprising that no author spoke to him as much as the political philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. His works exemplified both critical reasoning and passionate imagination. Despite Napoleon's liking for Rousseau, he does not share the author's idealistic take on human nature. At the bottom of it all, writes Napoleon, the natural spirit of man is the wish to dominate. And again, man in nature knows no other law than self-interest. Take care of himself, destroy his enemies, these were his daily jobs. Therefore, Napoleon argued that the state must be strong, supportive and secure. Paradoxically, Napoleon liked novels which describe the healthy-mindedness of simple people living close to nature, full of generous, humane and spontaneous feelings, in which he, like many, found an antidote to the cold, calculating perversity of sophisticated society. It is said that Napoleon read the melancholy and tragic Sorrows of Young Werther by Goethe, a tale of unrequited love, 5 times during this period. Even when reading for pleasure, Napoleon aimed at self-improvement. He copied into a notebook unfamiliar terms or names at the rate of 1 page of notes a day, 120,000 words altogether. From everything he read, he made long extracts, annotated, analysed and kept a notebook of thoughts. Reading without a pencil is just daydreaming, he declared. He wrote hurriedly and far into the night, and was often unable to decipher what he had written in the morning. Napoleon annotated histories of the Arabs, Venice, the Indies, England, Turkey, Switzerland and the Sorbonne. He annotated Voltaire's Essai sur les Mœurs, Machiavelli's History of Florence, Mirabeau's Des Lettres décachées, and Charles Rollin's Ancient History. Writers like these exercised a famously seductive influence on young minds, from the whole social spectrum, from aristocrats to plebeians. Most of Napoleon's reading stemmed from a glaringly obvious fact. Something was wrong with France. There was injustice, there was unnecessary poverty, there was corruption in high places. Napoleon, like everyone else, saw that reform was needed, and in order to figure out what type of reform, Napoleon began to read political theory. He started with Plato's Republic, and his main conclusion was, every man who rules issues orders not in his own interest, but in the interests of his subjects. Kings go to war for personal glory, republics fight for the defence of their citizens. In one of the essays Napoleon wrote, 2,500 words on the love of the patrie, he started, I am barely of age, and yet here I am writing history. I know my weakness. a too sincere awareness of the jaded human heart, though for the kind of writing I am doing now, perhaps that is the best state of mind and soul. I still have the enthusiasm which so often evaporates under a keen knowledge of men. The venality that comes with age will not sully this pen. I shall breathe only truth, and I believe I have the strength to speak it. In reading this brief sketch of our unhappiness, dear compatriots, I can feel your tears flow. We have always been children of woe. We are members of a powerful monarchy, but today we feel only the vices of its laws. We see no relief on the horizon from the evil being done us. In the rest of this essay, Napoleon celebrates the sincerity of ancient patriotism and condemns the lust for glory that passes for patriotism among many European realms. Two more main attitudes stand out. Napoleon had a keen sympathy for the oppressed and a distaste for tyranny in any form, whether it was the Almighty inflicting eternal damnation on souls, or Cardinal de Fleury boasting of having issued 40,000 lettres de cachet, that is, orders of imprisonment without a trial. Although unsympathetic to the absolutism of King Louis XIV's court, Napoleon quoted approvingly the remark made by Louis's grandson when refusing a new piece of furniture for his house: "The people can get the necessities of life only when princes forbid themselves of what is superfluous." The book which influenced Napoleon the most, and which he took the most notes on, was John Barrow's A New and Impartial History of England. To an impartial observer of Europe at that time, the notable fact would have been the success of despotic monarchies. But Napoleon averted his gaze from these successes and fixed it on the odd country out, England, with her monarchy limited by law. Napoleon studied all English constitutional struggles in detail. Napoleon commented, "The principal advantage of the English constitution consists in the fact that the national spirit is always in full vitality. For a long spell of years, the king can doubtless give himself more authority than he ought to have, may even use his great power to great injustice, but the cries of the nation soon change to thunder, and sooner or later the king yields." In Napoleon's view of the history of France, the original government of the Franks, he decided, had been a democracy strengthened by the power of the king and his knights. A new king was made by being lifted on a shield and acclaimed by his troops. Then the bishops arrived and preached despotism. Gradually the aura of kingship took hold of men's minds, and kings usurped an authority never originally granted to them. They no longer ruled in the interests of the people who had given them their power. Napoleon, like Rousseau, has some strong things to say about monarchies, and views kingly power as essentially a usurpation of society's power. He noted, "There are very few kings who haven't deserved to be dethroned." Napoleon decided that what was wrong with modern France was that the power of the king and the king's men had grown excessive. The reform Napoleon wanted was a constitution which, by setting out the people's rights, would ensure that the king acted in the interests of France as a whole. Napoleon wrote, "The goal of government is to lend assistance to the feeble against the strong, and by this means to allow everyone to enjoy a sweet tranquility, the road to happiness." While learning all this and forming his own views, Napoleon cannot have missed the fact that Alexander the Great had been the son of a king, while Caesar had been born into Rome's patrician nobility and had married into the most illustrious social circle of the Republic. Had they been born with less than this, then they would never have been permitted to move on to the high road of world history. By contrast, Napoleon had to confront the likelihood that he would not move up the ladder of military promotions despite his talents and hard work. Napoleon's protests against social prejudice were what had kept him at odds with his uniformed surroundings so far. The French Napoleon had had it in for as a schoolboy were not the people of the kingdom, but the elite, the gilded bunch of aristocrats. Napoleon read so much, partly because he hoped to become a writer. All in all, before the age of 26, Napoleon penned around 60 essays, short stories, philosophical pieces, histories, treatises, pamphlets and open letters, all of which were unpublished. His essays tended to be written in the classical conventions of the day, filled with bombast and rhetorical questions, and he began to hone the style that was later to characterize his proclamations and speeches, evocative and emphatic, sometimes turning to plaintive and confessional, other times to irony, switching between elegant and heavy-handed. Napoleon's most ambitious work was a history of Corsica, telling the story of the wrongs done against the island and her struggles for independence, in order to touch the French people, to arouse their feelings of humanity. Once they knew the facts, He thought they would surely demand freedom for the Corsicans. Napoleon sent a draft of it to the famous historian, Abbé Raynal, who approved of the young officer's book and advised him to have it printed. Spurred on with this positive feedback, Napoleon intended to make Paoli, who he heaped praise on, his central figure. Still exiled in London, Napoleon summoned up the courage to write to his old childhood hero. Napoleon would later ask him for useful documents. Paoli's reply, written some months later, was not calculated to encourage the would-be historian. Paoli said that he had no time to search for the documents, and that besides, Corsica was only important in any sense because of the men who had made it, not by writing of its achievements. Among other bits of fatherly counsel was, history should not be written by young men. Make ready for such an enterprise slowly. Patiently collect your anecdotes and facts. Accept the opinions of other writers with reserve. Perhaps disheartened by Paoli's response, Napoleon never finished his book on Corsica, but he did write several chapters and made the point that the Corsicans would have escaped subjection if only they had built a strong navy. At this point, Napoleon, like Paoli, envisioned Corsica as a Spartan or Roman state. He inveighed against the islanders' softness and cowardice, their corruption by French luxury, their servility and loss of self-mastery, and their lack of heroes or heroic self-sacrifice. Napoleon believed that Corsica must be freed by a strong and just man. Equally, he believed that a brave man must speak up for the French people and instigate reforms. He wanted a constitutional monarchy which ruled in the interests of the people. Napoleon wrote a 40-page essay, which he submitted to the Academy of Lyon in August 1791 as part of a writing competition, in answer to the question, what are the most important truths and feelings to instill into men for their happiness? The prize of 1,200 livres was more than his annual salary. Man, says Napoleon, is born to be happy. Nature, an enlightened mother, had endowed him with everything necessary to this end, and every man is born with the right to that part of the fruits of the earth necessary for subsistence. Napoleon next turns to feeling. According to him, man experiences the most exquisitely pleasant feelings when he is alone, in nature. This would be his most precious gift, had he not also received love of country, love of wife, and divine friendship. Napoleon wrote, a wife and children, a father and mother, brothers and sisters, a friend. Yet some people find fault with nature and ask why they were ever born. Occasionally, this idealism is interrupted by reminders of his youthful Napoleonic depression. Boredom, sadness, black melancholy, despair succeed one another in a man's heart, and if this state continues, he will kill himself. Napoleon's trust in feeling was also typical of his age, beginning to weary of cynicism and masks. Where Napoleon is original is in recognizing that a dangerous confusion may arise between true feeling, virtue, and passion masquerading as sentiment. He made reason, not the intensity of the feeling, the judge of feeling's worth. Napoleon continues, feeling makes us love what is beautiful and just, but it also makes us rebel against tyranny and evil. It is feeling that we must try to develop and protect from perversion. The good politician must therefore guide feeling by reason. At the same time, he must allow complete and absolute freedom of thought and freedom to speak and write, except where this would damage the social order. Tenderness, for instance, must not denigrate into softness. It is reason that distinguishes genuine feeling from violent passion, reason that keeps society going, reason that develops a national feeling and makes it great. To love one's country is an elementary feeling, but to love it above everything else is the love of beauty in all its energy, the pleasure of helping to make a whole nation happy. But Napoleon also discusses the twisted kind of patriotism, induced by ambition. He saves his most cutting words to denounce ambition, with its pale complexion, wild eyes, hurried footsteps, jerky gestures, and sardonic laugh. He even criticised Alexander the Great for hubris. He wrote, what is Alexander doing when he rushes from Thebes into Persia, and thence into India? He is ever restless, he loses his wits, he believes himself God. What is the end of Cromwell? He governs England, but is he not tormented by all the daggers of the Furies? Elsewhere in his notebooks, Napoleon had already discussed this theme. Brutus he calls an ambitious madman. As for the fanatical Arab prophet Hakim, who preached civil war, and having been blinded by illness, hid his sightless eyes with a mask of silver, explaining that he wore it in order to prevent people from being dazzled by the light radiating from his face, Napoleon scornfully comments, to what lengths can a man be driven by his passion for fame? Napoleon concluded his essay on happiness by contrasting the ambitious egoist, the man who lives in order to help himself, with the genuine patriot, the man who lives in order to help others. Through courage and strength of mind, the patriot attains happiness. What pleasure, Napoleon wrote, to die surrounded by one's children, and to be able to say, I've ensured the happiness of 100 families. I've had a hard life, but the state will benefit from it. Through my worries, my fellow citizens live calmly. Through my perplexities, they are content, and through my sorrows, they are happy. This is the essay written by 2nd Lieutenant Bonaparte while secluding himself in his cramped billet in Auxonne between parades and sentry duty. The patriot who Napoleon writes of is clearly Napoleon himself speaking. The heroism and chivalry that he had prized as a young cadet had now been eclipsed by a patriotism of a more workaday kind. He surpassed his admiration for the Canadian hero standing up for his rights. Instead, he sees himself as a member of the community, working on behalf of 100 families. And he does not see himself as a soldier, but as a civilian. He was probably disappointed that he did not win the prize, but that he even entered a French language competition showed considerable confidence. That year, not one of the essays submitted were deemed prize-worthy. Napoleon did not include Christianity as a factor in happiness, which is typical of his era. As he wrote in his notebook, Christianity declares that its kingdom is not of this world. How then can it stimulate affection for one's native land? How can it inspire any feelings but scepticism, indifference and coldness for human affairs and government? Later in his life, Napoleon was sometimes seen to cross himself before battle, and he certainly realised the social usefulness of religion. However, Napoleon was never a true Christian, and was unconvinced by the divinity of Jesus Christ, though he believed in some kind of divine power, even if it was one that seems to have a very limited interaction with the world, beyond its original creation, which makes him more of a deist. In another unpublished paper, Napoleon accused Christianity of encouraging tyranny because its promises of an afterlife detracted from man's desire to perfect this life. Only the social contract, an agreement between the people and state authority, could secure happiness. In answer to the question, does the religion of Christ in any of its forms get in the way of good government? Napoleon's answer was a resounding yes. The churches claim to be peacemakers. They claim to preach obedience to authority, yet at the bottom of it, Napoleon believed that they were competitors to government. He wrote, "Suppose a foreign army asks submission to your city, promising it has no evil intent. Do you let it in?" In Napoleon's eyes, in common with many of his generation, Christianity had proved to be lethal. 15 centuries of civil dissent, division and war, not to mention the competition between clergy and government. The place that God occupied in many people's hearts was replaced in young Napoleon, and in many other young Frenchmen, by his passion for la patrie. Madame Beethoven avait promis Madame Beethoven de faire égorger. While 2nd Lieutenant Bonaparte studied, planned reforms, and envisaged the life he would like to lead, France was moving towards crisis. Perhaps the root of the trouble was that no one any longer had the power to act. The well-meaning, still popular Louis XVI tried to make much-needed tax reforms, but the lawyers who composed the parliaments consistently refused to register them. As one young Paris councillor explained to a visitor, "You must know, sir, that in France, the job of a councillor is to oppose everything the king wants to do, even the good things." At every level, France consisted of groups frozen in opposition, and the strong national critical spirit ridiculed many proposed reforms. Lack of confidence swept across the nation, hitting trade hard in 1788. Then came an exceptionally severe winter. The Seine and other rivers froze. Trade was impeded. Cattle and sheep died. After many years of stability, the price of bread, meat and goods rose sharply, and this was at a time when many workshops were laying off men. The fear of hunger swept across France. An ex-priest called Sieyès published a political pamphlet which swept across the country. What is the Third Estate? Everything, but an everything shackled and oppressed. What would it be without the privileged order? Everything, but an everything free and flourishing. Nothing can succeed without it. Everything would be infinitely better without the others. Since the Middle Ages, France had been divided into a system of 3 social classes, or estates. The first 2 classes, the clergy and the nobility, had held all the power for centuries. There was no room for social climbing. Kings gave birth to kings. Paupers gave birth to paupers. The nobility and clergy represented only 3% of the French population. but it was they who decided the policies that governed the whole nation. The rest of the population, called the Third Estate, represented the poorest citizens, who wanted more rights and the dissolution of this ancien régime political system. Now the common people had found a pen in the form of Sieyès, and soon found a voice in Mirabeau, who, like young Napoleon, wished to see France become a constitutional monarchy. At the end of March 1789, in the small town of Seurs, a barge was being loaded with wheat. It had been purchased by a businessman and was about to be shipped away, but the people of Seurs, convinced that their food was being bought up, rioted and prevented the barge from leaving, killing 2 grain merchants. A detachment of 100 soldiers was quickly sent to restore order, and Napoleon was second in command. In Seurs, Napoleon came to experience firsthand the mood of the French people, frightened and angry, as they clamoured not only for food, but for social justice. Napoleon believed that every Frenchman had a right to subsistence, and he sympathised with them over the high price of bread. On the other hand, he hated the disorder and chaos of riots and mob action. "Let honest men go to their homes," the 19-year-old shouted to the crowd. "I only fire upon the mob." Napoleon certainly disapproved when other soldiers broke into the headquarters and stole regimental funds, and of Baron de Thiel's country house being set on fire. Lawyer's son that he was, Napoleon wanted this new popular movement to be expressed civilly, peacefully and constitutionally. Before long, the rioters were attacking public buildings in Auxonne too, and burning down the tax offices. Everywhere the peasants stand firm, in Dauphin especially so. They are ready to die for the constitution. The women are royalist. This is not surprising, for liberty is lovelier than any of them and eclipses them all. On the 14th of July 1789, sheer chaos broke out in the streets of Paris, and angry crowds headed for the Bastille. This prison was shrouded in mystery. Legends abounded of the torture incurred by the men who resided within its 8 stoic towers. Much like the Tower of London, the Bastille was symbolic of the monarchy in many ways. It was a silent institution that answered to no one, yet doled out punishment as it saw fit. The mob stormed the fortress, setting loose prisoners and gathering gunpowder. 2 symbols of the coming French Revolution were brandished that day: the tricolour, the people's flag of red and blue, divided by Bourbon white, and the heads of the massacred on pikes. The march on the Bastille proved how relentless and determined the French people were about their fight for freedom. Even after the last guard was killed and the last prisoner set free, the people stayed behind to dismantle the prison, which was decimated from the top down. The French Revolution had begun, and would continue for 10 long, hard, troubled years. For a man who was to exhibit such acute political sharpness later in his career, Napoleon completely misread the revolution's opening stages. "I repeat what I have said to you," he wrote to Joseph, a week after the fall of the Bastille. "Calm will return. In a month, there will no longer be a question of anything." What interested Napoleon most about this event were the new and introduced decrees of the National Assembly that followed. The Assembly abolished certain privileges of the clergy and nobility, gave the vote to 4.5 million men who possessed at least a little land or property, and essentially written King Louis out of authority. They soon created a Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, of which the 2 key articles are the first and fourth. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions can be based only upon public usefulness, and liberty consists of the power to do anything that does not injure others. All men were declared equal, and the old class system was a distant memory of France's feudal past. Napoleon was a French nobleman. His friends and fellow officers were also French noblemen. Because as nobles they shed, or were ready to shed, their blood for the king, they paid no taxes. They belonged to an elite. As a nobleman, Napoleon would be able to rise in the ranks to Marshal of France, and the fact that commoners could not vastly increased his chances of getting to the top. Now these privileges were suddenly swept away, and many resented it. More than half of Napoleon's fellow officers refused to accept the new situation, and many, including his best friend Alexandre, decided to emigrate. But for Napoleon, he did not dream of going abroad to join the princes of the blood who were determined to destroy this new constitution. If, in the storm of this new popular movement, he lost his privileges, that was a small price to pay. What he saw was a constitution which limited the monarchy by law. This was something he had been hoping for years. Of course, Napoleon still faithfully carried out his military duties. putting down food riots in Auxonne, arresting 33 people, spending the better part of an hour exhorting the rioters to stop, and proudly reporting home that his commanding general had asked for his advice on the situation. And yet, Napoleon was among the first to join the new revolutionary society in Valence, of which he became secretary. He wrote, "This year promises to be favourable to good people after so many centuries of oppression and slavery." And again, "This year has been wonderful for forward thinkers, and after all these centuries of feudal barbarism and political slavery, it is surprising to see how the word liberty sets minds on fire that appeared to be demoralised under the influence of luxury, indulgence and art. While France is being regenerated, what will become of us unfortunate Corsicans?" At least in its early stages, the revolution fit in well with Napoleon's own Enlightenment ideals: equality before the law, rational government, meritocracy, efficiency and patriotism. He believed the new social order it promised to usher in would be built on logic and reason, and provide far better career opportunities for an ambitious young outsider without money or connections. Despite detesting mobs, he saw power passing to the French people, and he believed that this in turn would help Corsica. The French people, he felt sure, would sympathise with the islanders and help end colonial rule on Corsica. But very soon, as the revolution intensified, Napoleon's youthful idealism would be swept away. Napoleon would be forced to make a choice: this new revolutionary France, or his Corsican homeland.